Question: can a 91-year-old woman living on America's West Coast save democracy in the United States in 15 minutes? I think the answer is a resounding yes. The woman is Ruth Payne, and she is exceedingly well known to anyone who knows anything about the JFK assassination. Ruth, along with her husband Michael, was intimately involved with CIA Director Allen Dulles, Dulles' spy mistress Mary Bancroft, and a host of top CIA and intelligence officials, spending months at a time with them on Nassau Island, the island retreat owned by Michael's family. Ruth was the woman who befriended Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina Oswald at a party in February 1963, arranged by CIA asset George de Mohrenschildt. De Mohrenschildt had been babysitting Lee Oswald for the CIA since the end of Oswald's fake defection to the Soviet Union. Ruth was the woman who suddenly asked Marina Oswald to move in with her in June of 1963, picking up Marina and her baby in New Orleans in September, just 2 months before the JFK assassination, and bringing them to Dallas. Ruth is the woman whose supposedly estranged husband, Michael, would take Oswald to at least 6 political meetings in the 2 months before the assassination, seemingly in an attempt to set him up as a political radical. Ruth was the woman who would get Lee Oswald the job at the Texas School Book Depository, only weeks before the motorcade would pass right under his building, with the motorcade route being changed at the very last minute. After Oswald's death, Ruth would be the woman who would claim to find a letter written by Lee Oswald, claiming that he was the person responsible for firing a shot at General Edwin Walker several months before the JFK murder, although all eyewitnesses described 2 men involved, neither of which looked like Oswald. Oh, we're not done. Ruth was the woman who would then claim to find another letter written to the Russian embassy by Lee Oswald, which Ruth would say she copied in her own handwriting from the supposed actual letter. Then she was the woman who would suddenly claim to find material associating Lee Oswald with Mexico City in a drawer in her house that had already been searched multiple times by the FBI and the Dallas police when the whole Mexico City story seemed to be falling apart. But there is more. Ruth is the woman who, 2 weeks after the JFK murder, would arrange to have a reflex camera found in a duffel bag belonging to Lee Oswald in her garage. The camera would be associated with the famous backyard photos. That duffel bag had already been searched thoroughly right after the assassination, and no camera was found. Ruth is also the woman who would have 7 metal filing cabinets taken from her house the day of the assassination by the Dallas police. Dallas Police Sheriff Buddy Walters would report that those file cabinets contained names and information about suspected Cuban sympathizers and also about the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Payne was clearly involved in spying on both groups for the CIA. She would later state to me that the file cabinets contained folk dance records. Ruth is the woman who would then go on to be outed as a CIA informant gathering information for the violent CIA-sponsored Contras in Nicaragua a few years later. And Ruth is the woman who has done everything possible to denigrate Lee Oswald in every way possible, both in front of the Warren Commission and with numerous TV and media interviews for the last 60 years. I contacted Ruth Payne back in 2013 and tried to do a video interview with her asking the tough questions that no one else had. Immediately, she began to try and qualify me as someone she could control by asking my opinion of the Walker shooting and if I thought Oswald was responsible. When I was honest and told her there was a lot of evidence with none of it pointing to Oswald, she told me that that was her litmus test. She would only work with journalists who believed Oswald shot at General Walker. In other words, she would not go further with any honest journalist trying to really get to the truth. She would only participate with journalists who she knew she could control and limit. So how could this 91-year-old woman now save democracy in the United States? How? Simply by telling the truth. If Ruth Payne admitted that both she and her husband Michael were operatives for the CIA and that she was babysitting Oswald for the CIA in Dallas, then the whole JFK assassination would be blown wide open. American citizens would not just discover the truth about the CIA's role in the assassination, but also about the FBI's role in covering up the crime. And just as important, about the myriad number of reporters on the payroll of the CIA and some of the largest newspapers in the country who perpetrated the lies and cover-ups surrounding the assassination. We would learn that these same reporters and media assets helped infiltrate the Jim Garrison investigation in New Orleans when he got close to the truth in the mid to late 1960s. As one of the few people still alive who had such a prominent part in the JFK assassination, Ruth Payne could finally verify what the majority of Americans have always believed: that President John Kennedy was murdered not by a lone nut, but by the very out-of-control CIA and right-wing industrialists who wanted the profits of a war in Vietnam, and the continuation of a world where their own profit and greed was much more important than the peaceful and much fairer world President Kennedy was trying to establish. I am including now the entire in-depth video I produced on Ruth and Michael Payne a few months ago.
Yeah, he's got to be here. There he is. There he is. There he comes. No, this is really one spot where he's on the t-shirt.
And so it ended. The life of Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who was arrested 2 days earlier, shortly after the assassination of the president, and quickly accused of being a lone nut gunman. But how this 24-year-old former Marine got to the basement of the Dallas police headquarters may be the most important aspect of the assassination story. And that all happened, to a large extent, under the direction of these two people, Ruth and Michael Payne. After a decade of researching the Kennedy assassination in the early 2000s, I was drawn to the role the Paynes played in the lives of Lee Oswald and his wife Marina. In 2011, I located Ruth Payne and conducted a series of phone calls and email correspondence with her in an attempt to get her to sit for a video interview about her relationship with the Oswalds. From the very beginning of that correspondence, it was obvious to me that Ruth was trying to qualify me as someone who she could control, someone who would ultimately strongly endorse the lone gunman theory.
Said that to me yet. The first thing I heard about was when the newspaper reporters in the hall asked me that question.
Ruth's litmus test was the Walker shooting. General Edwin Walker was an extreme right-wing John Birch proponent who had been admonished by the Joint Chiefs of Staff for trying to influence the voting of his troops. In October 1962, Walker was also arrested for promoting protests against the admission of black students into an all-white university. Walker claims someone tried to kill him with a shot through his window that went into a wall. There is considerable doubt as to whether it may have even been a staged event for publicity. According to the Warren Report, there were no eyewitnesses, although a 14-year-old boy in a neighboring house claimed that immediately after the shooting he saw two men in separate cars drive out of a church parking lot adjacent to Walker's home. A friend of Walker's testified that 2 nights before the shooting, he saw two men around the house peeking in windows. Neither report identified anyone matching Oswald's description. Weeks after the JFK assassination, Ruth would miraculously find a letter supposedly written by Lee and hidden by Marina in a book that Ruth was returning. The letter was supposed to be written by Oswald, claiming responsibility for the Walker attempt. Even the Secret Service had grave doubts about the validity of the note, and fingerprint analysis found prints of 7 people on the note, none of them Lee or Marina. Ruth asked my feelings about the incident, and when I mentioned in my reservations that Oswald was involved, this was her email reply. Dear Ted, sorry to have been so long replying to your message. I confess it depressed me. It let me know that you have primarily read conspiracy books rather than primary sources, even though the testimony had come from the Warren Commission. And then she tried to direct me to sources that aren't primary, namely Vincent Bugliosi's book, Reclaiming History, and she lists the pages. She also says that the Warren Commission was very thorough in their research, and she says that she's waiting for a book by Max Holland about the Warren Commission. He's taking a long time writing it. I have met him and feel he is a good researcher. And I think that speaks for itself. She was trying to qualify me as someone she could control, and she would not give me an interview when she realized that I wasn't going to be someone that she could manipulate. When Ruth ultimately rejected my request for a formal interview, I posed 10 questions that I really needed her to answer for my own understanding. And to her credit, she answered in an email reply. The questions included her connections with the CIA or intelligence agencies, Lee's letter from Marina found in the book, the boxes listed by Buddy Walther as having contact information about Cuban sympathizers, the cameras found, and more. I will show these questions and answers in a later video. But let's start now by taking a look at Michael and Ruth Payne. Michael Payne's mother is a member of the wealthy Forbes family. His stepfather was Arthur M. Young, inventor of the Bell helicopter, and Michael worked with security clearance at Bell. It should be noted that Kennedy had signed National Security Action Memo 263, pulling all American advisors out of Vietnam by the end of 1965. That order was rescinded 4 days after the assassination. Bell sold thousands of helicopters during the Vietnam War. Later, Michael was president of the CIA front company, Gibraltar Steamship Corporation, that leased Swan Island in the Caribbean for the CIA, where the agency set up Radio Swan, which was used during the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, among other things. The Forbes owned Nassau Island near Cape Cod, and this is where it gets interesting. Michael Payne's mother, Ruth Forbes Young's best friend, is Mary Bancroft, a CIA agent and spy. But there is more. She is the longtime mistress of Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, and a prime member of the Warren Commission. Both Bancroft and Dulles were frequent visitors to Nassau Island and knew Michael well. Ruth and Michael spent summers on Nassau Island, and Ruth will spend time there in the summer of 1963, right before leaving to pick up Marina Oswald to live with her for the 2 months before the assassination. You think that's something? Well, there's way more. On Ruth's side, her father is William A. Hyde. He did extensive work for the Agency for International Development in Latin America. AID was a well-known cover for CIA agency personnel, and Hyde's filed reports were directly routed to the CIA. Further, in 1957, he was under consideration by the CIA for covert use in Vietnam. Ruth Payne's sister is Sylvia Hoke. Hoke was a psychologist and an employee for the CIA beginning in 1954. After leaving Nassau Island late in the summer of '63, Ruth traveled to D.C. for several days with Sylvia before leaving to pick up Marina. You seriously couldn't have more CIA connections in two families if you tried. But we have one more CIA connection that must be identified. He is George de Mohrenschildt, a white Russian who was a petroleum geologist and CIA field agent. When Lee Oswald returns from the Soviet Union, he is immediately introduced to de Mohrenschildt, who befriends the Oswalds and provides resources for them. Later, de Mohrenschildt will tell friends that he handled Oswald for the CIA and did in fact hand him over to the Paynes.
Did you kill the president?
The second explosive revelation in the sealed documents also links the CIA directly to Oswald. While living in Dallas, Oswald was befriended by Russian-born George de Mohrenschildt. Investigators determined he was a contract agent for the CIA in Central America and the Caribbean. In 1977, moments before he was to be interviewed by House investigators, de Mohrenschildt blew his brains out with a 20-gauge shotgun. House investigators believe he was a crucial link between the CIA and Lee Harvey Oswald.
There is no question that the sealed JFK files are extremely embarrassing for the CIA. House investigators have told Inside Edition that the agency did not fully cooperate in their investigation and that the CIA had final say in the report that the House Assassinations Committee made public. Thus, the public report makes no mention of the CIA's links with Lee Harvey Oswald. But the secret documents are another story.
One interesting sidelight, the movie JFK was partially based on Jim Garrison's investigation in New Orleans. Well, House investigators uncovered evidence that the CIA planted 9 agents inside the Garrison investigation to feed him false information and to report back to Langley on what Garrison was finding.
It is de Mohrenschildt who will have a party on February 22, 1963, making sure Lee and Marina are present and inviting Ruth Payne. Pretty interesting coincidence. Ruth will immediately cozy up to Marina under the auspices of wanting to practice Russian. Ruth will continue to contact the pregnant Marina and then invite her and her infant daughter to live with her in Dallas. De Mohrenschildt, having handed off the Oswalds to Ruth and Michael, will now go to Washington, D.C. for meetings with Army intelligence, and then to Haiti, where he receives a reported $300,000 in his bank account without performing any services. Let's hold up here and consider. By this time, February 1963, Ruth and Michael will claim to be separated. They have 2 very small children, a 2-year-old and another child, 3.5. Both Ruth and Michael will make statements that they did not like Lee very much and even accuse him of physically accosting Marina at times. So with 2 very small children and a father who is not going to be present since he is separated, Michael and Ruth invite people they don't even know with a possible propensity for domestic violence by Lee to live in extremely close contact with their children? Does that make sense? What father or mother would invite or even allow a stranger with a propensity for domestic violence to be around their children? And this man, Lee, was supposedly a defector to our country, to our arch enemy, the Soviet Union. Ruth will state that they invited Marina and her children to move in, not Lee, but that makes no sense as Lee was at the Payne household every weekend. Further, Michael, who was supposed to be estranged from Ruth at this time and living in Fort Worth, will nonetheless come to the Payne household also every week. But instead of spending time with his children, he will take Lee to no less than 6 right and left-wing meetings. Michael seems to be clearly setting Lee Oswald up to be accused of extreme political activism at some soon-to-be time. But let's go in chronological order. February 22, 1963, Ruth meets the Oswalds at the Mohrenschildt's party. She keeps in contact. Early August 1963, Ruth packs her 2 children and takes a long road trip, stopping first at Nassau Island to spend weeks with her in-laws, even though she's supposed to be separated from their son. In September, Ruth leaves Nassau Island and travels to Washington, D.C., where she spends time with her sister, Sylvia Hoke, who is a psychologist for the CIA and has been employed by the agency since '54. Hoke's husband also works for intelligence in the Agency for International Development. From Washington, Ruth heads to New Orleans, where she picks up pregnant Marina and her toddler and takes them to live with her in Dallas. It will be 2 months until Kennedy will be killed. Then Michael Payne, estranged husband of Ruth, still comes to the Payne home every week, but instead of spending time with his children, he takes Lee Oswald to no less than 6 political meetings. Does any of this make sense if they were not babysitting the Oswalds for the CIA and making sure to set up Lee Oswald for any type of later inquiry into his supposed radical political beliefs? Hang on, it gets better. It is Ruth who gets the job at the Texas School Book Depository for Lee. She will claim that it was just a coincidence and that she heard of the job from a neighbor, but it's funny because Ruth will first deny and then admit that a better job offer came from an employment agency in the way of a phone call for Lee, but she never told him about that opportunity. And let's move to the day of the assassination. An hour after the killing, Michael is at his office at Bell Helicopter in Fort Worth. He calls Ruth. And remember that this is before Lee Oswald has even been reported to be a subject. What Michael doesn't know is that the phone call is being monitored. Michael is reported as saying that Oswald will be blamed for the killing, but they both knew who was really responsible for the assassination. Ruth will admit that the phone call took place, but will try and deny that that is exactly what was said. In Dallas, the police do 2 searches of the Payne home the day of the assassination. And yet the backyard photos are not found or listed in any inventory sheets. They will be found in a separate search the next day. And the Imperial reflex camera that took the famous backyard photos and a miniature Minox spy camera won't be located until weeks later. Here's the official report. Yet somehow the Imperial reflex camera that supposedly took the backyard photos will miraculously show up in the already searched bags of Oswald in the garage. And here again is a report that shows the bags were already searched and no camera was present. The Minox spy camera will actually be withheld by the FBI and then will be claimed by Michael Payne, who said he had dropped it in salt water and cleaned it with kerosene, eliminating, of course, any fingerprints. It gets worse. Several weeks after the assassination, real doubt was being shed on whether Lee Oswald had ever even traveled to Mexico City, as was claimed by intelligence services. The CIA had provided photos and voice of someone clearly not Oswald. Miraculously, again, it is Ruth Payne who comes to the rescue, suddenly finding postcards and printed material in a room used by Oswald in her home. And then finally, the Walker letter. 8 days after the assassination of President Kennedy on November 30th, Ruth Payne supposedly inadvertently discovers evidence that Lee Oswald had attempted to assassinate General Walker. Among the letters that Ruth Payne repeatedly sent to Marina was a thick book of household advice in Russian. Ruth said the book contained an undated note left by Lee for Marina on April 10th, and when it was analyzed, 7 sets of prints were on it, none of them belonging to either Lee or Marina. And it's funny, but Michael Payne will move back into the home right after the assassination. And finally, we're not quite done yet, because Ruth is going to turn up once again years later, this time in Nicaragua, supposedly trying to help leftist Sandinistas who are fighting for fair wages and freedom against the right-wing Contras. The U.S. government is secretly funneling money and support to the Contras, and many people down there think Ruth was a spy taking pictures and gathering info on the Sandinistas she was claiming to be trying to help. For those researchers and others who claim that Michael and Ruth Payne were played by the CIA, that they were just doing favors, I say think again.